the main part of this afternoon segment for me is going to be about shame. Because one of the things that we need to talk about over and above all of the things that we've talked about so far, the code confusion and all the different variables that are in play in the instructional process that Reed talked about during his session, is that for many children, once they've struggled along with this, in other words, when they didn't take off initially, right, and they've been at it, and they're trying, and they're trying, and they're trying, the problem's no longer all that original stuff. It's now all that original stuff amplified and complicated by the fact that they've now got their emotional intelligence saying, I don't want to do this anymore, wanting to leave the scene. And it's not just an unfortunate emotional side issue. It's a fundamental distraction to the neurocognitive and linguistic capacity to do this. Right? It's what I call the downward spiral of shame, where what they've learned about learning to read is now what's primarily interfering with their ability to learn to read. So before we do that, which is going to be the main part of our conversation, I just want to reiterate that what we're talking about, again, is this readiness, how ready a child is to take on this challenge, right? And this is a whole hour-long thing just to go into this. But I would say that, as Reed was discussing, this is basically built on language, on two things, language and emotion, right? That it takes the language background, it also takes emotional fortitude, emotional resiliency. It takes a capacity to handle this frustration, this confusion, and not go self-negative, not want to bail out, right? So in a way you can say that our capacity for frustration, our frustration tolerance, as some use the language, is really a description of a certain quality of our emotional resilience. If we don't have the emotional resilience to stay in the frustration, because it's going to be frustrating for kids that aren't developmentally ready, then our lack of emotional resilience decreases our frustration tolerance, which decreases our attention span and undermines our ability to do this. So language and emotion. And I really invite you that haven't been to the website to actually check out this one section. So like I said, it's about an hour of videos. And it deals just with the foundations of readiness that are important to this. And then there's the various things that we were talking about earlier on having to do with the confusion. I want to touch on this a little bit more because this confusion that children are experiencing in the course of learning to read is unlike anything else they've ever experienced in their life. This is an artificial form of confusion. It's not like natural learning. With natural learning, and you're going to see, for those of you that stay tomorrow into the health of learning conversation, we'll go into this a little bit more. But right now, I would just say that there's a distinction that we need to make between natural modes of learning and artificial modes of learning. Natural modes of learning are modes of learning in which, like walking and talking, we're actually getting organic feedback from ourselves or from our enmeshment in nature, into the way nature functions. Right? Look at the baby stutter as they're walking, right? The baby, nobody's teaching the baby to walk. There's no mental ticker tape. They're going, no, I move my right foot, and I move my left foot, right? It's they're gravity dancing. They're learning not to fall, right? And the learning not to fall is happening on the living edge of now, right? They're learning to differentiate and dance on the living edge of now. That is the way all natural organic learning happens. Whether we're talking about learning to speak, right? It goes on and on. The point is that when we're learning to listen to language, when we're learning our minds are pulling ourselves into understanding the language that's surrounding us, that's happening in real time. Right? When we're learning to differentiate what tastes good from what doesn't taste good, That's happening in real time. Or with smelling, right? Or when a child's first experimenting with physical manipulatives. These are all activities that we're naturally fantastic at. Nobody needs to teach us about. We just need to have an environment that will motivate, draw us into doing that. And that on the edge of that process, right, we're getting feedback right on the edge of doing it live. That we're tuning into and using as a way to learn our way in. Yeah? This is the natural mode of learning, and everything about our kind of ascendancy in nature is based on this incredible power of our capacity for natural learning. The problem our children face today, and reading is the #1 kind of gateway into the artificial world, is the challenges of artificial learning, where what's right or wrong or correct or incorrect isn't based on some kind of an internal living edge of now differentiation that a child can make within their own experience. It's now in reference to some external, social, conventional, technological, human-created reference. Right? So in learning to read, it's not about what feels right on the inside. It's about what's right according to a series of outside conventions that are not involved in the nervous system. So that's one important distinction. The next most important distinction, I think, in order to pivot off of this, is that we're talking about, remember we talked about the confusion that was in the code, right? And there's another, on my website, there's a thing that spends like 10 minutes or so just going into how confusing it is, and it's very entertaining and whatever. We don't have time for it. I just would say that it is confusing. Everybody recognizes that? Right? It's not like, you know, there's not a one-to-one simple correspondence. There's a kind of a assembly process that has to happen to make the letters and the sounds work together to create an internal experience of the right word. Right? Now, what's really important to add to that is that this has to happen at incredible speed. In other words, and there's two ways to come at this, understanding the speed. I talked to neuroscientists that are studying the movement of sound, or what's called the temporal profile of sound. As I stand here and talk with you, right, do you pick up on some of the words that Reed used, like cat and hat and mat and bat, right? The difference between those words is happening in less than 1/10 of a second. In other words, in order for your brain to be able to understand those words, your brain's paying attention to variations in sound that are happening at this phenomenal rate. Less than 1/10 of a second makes the difference between bad, cat, bat, etc., right? Mat. So in order to read, reading has to generate something in our minds that has an approximate temporal profile of spoken language. That's what our brains are used to comprehending, right? So the reading machinery has to produce a simulation of language that's happening at roughly the same rate that language is happening. Right? So what that means is that the reading system has to actually construct this thing at that kind of speed, even faster than speech. Think of it like there's a machine that's got to create this. Its output has to be roughly the speed of speech. So its processing has to be happening much faster. That make sense? I'll give you an example. There's two different ways to get at this. One has to do with just dissecting and differentiating and analyzing the waveforms of speech. Like I said, the 1/10 of a second between bad and dad and cat and bat and so forth. Another one is that I think is really interesting is that people have studied how the eyes pay attention to things.
Some interesting things about children when they come to learn to read, and there are a lot of things that they have to master that they haven't done before, and one of them is coordinating the eyes. I mean, you know, they look at television and they look at their world around them, but they haven't actually had to focus their attention so precisely as they have to when they start reading. You know, we're talking about moving your eyes about 3 characters, which is about 1 degree of visual angle, when most eye movements are making before that are much bigger. I'm mainly interested in finding out what's going on inside the head as people are reading and understanding. I think what eye movements are doing is reflecting the moment-to-moment processing that people are engaging in. Because there's time that's involved in moving the eyes from one place to another, so that the latency, just the simple motor reaction time of the eye, is about 150 milliseconds at least. So there's not a lot of time in there to process the information that you're looking at, yet it's still interesting that as I said, the eyes are being influenced by how hard or easy the word is to process.
How hard or easy the word is to process. When you actually break it down, and I did, and I'm going to jump over that just from the sake of time right now. On average, the brain has got to process letters into sounds in about 25 milliseconds per letter sound correspondence. Think about that. We don't actually do it that way. We do it in larger groups, right? But on average, so let's just round it off to a tenth of a second. On average, the brain has to be scanning across these letters and making them into sound, right? And hearing that at approximately that range. That's what a good reader is doing. Obviously, that's not what a struggling reader is doing, right? A tenth of a second. What that means is that all that confusion that we've been talking about, all the 300 and something different ways that we can spell 46 sounds with 26 letters, there's actually over 1,000, but there's about 300 in common use. And all those different combinatoric possibilities, learning how to do that on average the brain has less than a tenth of a second per letter sound confusion to work it out before it's going to start to stutter, before it's going to start to take too long. Now, is that the child's fault? Whether we talk about the fact that the child may not have heard enough vocabulary. I mean, as I mentioned last night, for those of you here, I'll just repeat it real quickly. Children, before they're actually born, are already listening through the womb walls for the language that's around them. They come in and they're immediately trying to learn their way into language, right? And they're like, the story of the fish in the tank, right? The fish grows to the size of the tank. Turns out, I looked it up, that's a kind of myth. It's not true. But it's a great metaphor in the fact that children really do kind of learn their way into what's possible in the tank they're in the emotional tank they're in the linguistic tank they're in the social emotional relationship tank they're in, right? In the knowledge tank they're in. So the family creates this kind of learning environment space, which you might say is like a tank, and they kind of grow into what's possible inside of that space. And if that tank isn't sufficiently rich in exercising all the different dimensions, both the kind of emotional self-esteem issues and the linguistic stuff that you heard Reed talking about, then they're on the wrong trajectory to hit this obstacle course and bunch through it. Is that their fault? No. Yeah, that's not their fault. Is the code mess their fault? No. None of this is their fault, right? One of the things, because this is kind of a conversation about emotion, that I also think is really important to get into real quickly, is that we're talking about both the motivation to learn to read, which is an important piece in all this, implicit in a lot of what Reed talked about. I'm going to make it a little bit more explicit. And the emotional attention span to get through the confusion, right? And the shame piece, which we're going to close with. Let's talk about motivation to begin with. There's never been a time in the past 300 or 400 years where there's been less of a motivational incentive for children to learn to read than there is right now. For most of you that are anywhere near my age, we grew up in an age, and certainly everybody before us even more so, right, in which if you wanted to escape the small bubble of what was possible in thought in your family environment, right, if you wanted to seek out intellectual rich stimulation, the only path available to you was to read. Right? So whatever you were interested in, if you wanted to break out of the confines of the little world that you grew up into and extend into a more rich understanding of the world, whether it was sports in another city or whether it was, science fiction or cartoons or whatever it was, comics, right? Whatever. The pathway for the average child to get intellectually rich stimulation was reading. That isn't true anymore. Right? Kids are surrounded by cable television and iPads and iPods and every kind of intellectual stimulation you can imagine. No brain work required. Boom, I get it. I can watch it. I can play it. Right? On top of that, so you understand the motivational difference? This is really important. So now kids are reading because people are telling them they got to read. There's much less intrinsic drive to want to learn to read. So on the one hand, it's never been more important to learn to read. On the other hand, there's never been less of a natural incentive to do it. On another level, connected to motivation, is you ever listen to a group of 4 or 5-year-olds having a conversation? Huh? I mean, when I started, that's one of the things I did. I just record that and kind of drop in, fly on the wall, listening, and know what's going on. And I was blown away at their speed, complexity, richness, range of vocabulary. And I asked the question, why does a child who's so facile in dancing with language in such complex ways with their friends and with their family at the age of 4 or 5, think about all the language they're using. And then think about the vocabulary that's in the average beginning reader for a 4 or 5-year-old. So why does a brain that's capable of all this want to read that moronic stuff? Yeah? So my point simply is that there's a lot of things that are working against the kind of intrinsic motivation, and that's an important part of the equation here. Sitting over top of that issue, which is kind of the takeoff motivation, is that, like I started when I began this session, for children who struggle too long at this, the main thing they start to struggle with is their emotional response to the struggle. Let me illustrate this by asking a simple question. If I was to say, and they do this all the time, like Family Feud, what do adults most fear? Public speaking. Definitely their parents. Yeah, it's funny, and we'll talk more about this tomorrow. I hope you'll come back tomorrow, because tomorrow we're going to talk about how this connects to learning writ large. But public speaking, let's take that for example. Basically, the number one thing human beings are afraid of, other than imminent physical danger or death, or the physical danger or death of a loved one, the thing that we're most afraid of is shame. And that's what when we say that we're the number one thing that comes up in survey after survey is public speaking, right? Now, what is it we're asking little children to do in classrooms? We're asking them to become public speakers in the midst of their struggle with learning to read. I mean, how insane can that be? On the one hand, if they don't speak out loud, it's hard for us to understand where they're at. I'm not trying to say, right? There's a reason for this insanity. On the other hand, the more primal thing is not just to understand all of this from the outside-in perspective of what's involved in teaching it. We also have to understand this from the inside-out experience of the struggles that are going on in the nervous system of our children. And no matter what you say, no matter what we think is right, wrong, or otherwise, when a child's emotional reality, the force of their emotions is wanting to get out of something, it's going to be very hard for them to do it. So, shame. Shame, as I mentioned last night, and we'll build on a lot more tomorrow, is a really natural, basic, fundamental human affect emotion. And it's just core of who we are as part of our organism. And shame can work against learning. Shame is probably the biggest single disabler of our learning. It's the biggest enabler of our learning. It's the biggest disabler of our learning. Let me give you an example of how powerful this can be. Those of you that have heard this before, bear with me, but it's always the audience favorite.
The other kids could make the books talk. They'd pick the books up and words would come out. He said, to me it just looked like lines and circles and squiggles. I had no idea where the words were. The teacher began hassling me because I wasn't able to read. And by the end of October, the kids were making fun of me because I couldn't read. And I realized it wasn't going to be too long before my mom and dad found out that I wasn't doing my job. He said, so I was scared. I was really scared. He said, but I was also a real resourceful kid. And I looked around the room and I noticed there was another kid in the class who couldn't read. This kid couldn't read a lick. And yet nobody made fun of him because he couldn't read, and the teacher didn't hassle him because he couldn't read, because he was deaf. wore a hearing aid. He had a hearing loss. And because he was deaf, no one expected him to read on time. He said, so I figured in my 6-year-old mind, the solution to my problem was to convince everyone that I was deaf. And if I could convince everyone I was deaf, they'd stop hassling me about the reading. He said, so I went on a one-man campaign to convince everyone in my life that I couldn't hear. He said, and everything was fine until June. I said, well, what happened in June, Dan? He said, my mom and dad sat me down the last day of school in June in the 1st grade and said, Dan, we're really worried about your hearing. You don't seem to be able to hear. We've taken you to hearing doctors and audiologists all over Cape Cod. Nobody can figure out what it is. So we've made an appointment for you. And you're going to go to Boston Children's Hospital next week. And you're going to stay there for 4 days and 3 nights. And they're going to do exploratory ear surgery and have your adenoid surgically removed. And this 6-year-old kid went through 3 days of surgery rather than tell his parents what he'd done. Can you imagine the trauma of a 6-year-old child going through surgery that only he knows he didn't need?
The power of shame, right? I mean, we'll do anything to hide it, right? To avoid it. The stories like that are legion. That particular piece goes on and on to talk with the director of the National Center for Learning Disabilities and the president of the world's largest literacy organization, both of which talk particularly about adults that, like the average low literate adult goes through a supermarket, they don't see what we see. They're constantly in a confused state of shameful panic, trying to get what they need and get out of there without exposing the fact that they can't read. Right?
They said we have to read out of a book or something. I'm afraid they're going to make us read out loud.
I was hoping to be the last person called, but I was the first person called. I didn't really want to read it, but she said you have to, and I was embarrassed to read it, so I had to read it. So I read it, and after that I was really embarrassed.
I feel like, oh my God.
So nervous. I'm nervous. Nervous makes me feel shy.
Shy? What is shy?
When you're scared to do something, and there's a whole bunch of people around.
Isn't that brilliant? I mean, kids.
Start sweating, I'd be like, I don't know if I literally start sweating, but I would. I'd get real nervous, and you could see that I was getting nervous and embarrassed.
Again, this is happening in a public setting. Can you imagine any of you? Suppose maybe you had a thing about singing or dancing or whatever, and all of a sudden, somebody like me said, come up stage here and do it for everybody. Not only would you be terrified, right? But, and this is the point we're going to kind of get to as this closes, I just want to touch on now, is that the shame that you'd feel by having to do it in public would actually make your ability to do it much worse than if you were in a closet by yourself, right? So the shame isn't just a bad feeling that's unfortunate that we're having, it fundamentally interferes with our ability to do something, whatever it is that we're ashamed of.
I kept messing up on the words and people kept laughing at me.
They said that you don't know how to read. I bet you won't be able to know how to read when you grow up.
They always laugh at me if I get twisted up with words. It makes my heart drop. Because it seems like they're not my friend no more.
My teacher asked me to come into the front of the class and read a book. And everybody was staring at me, and I got real nervous because I didn't want to mess up or anything. And then when I started reading, I started messing up, and I just couldn't help it, and everybody started laughing at me and stuff, so.
Like the teacher would ask me to read something, and I would read it, and I'd get a wrong word, or I'd go too slow, and they'll make fun of me.
Ever since then, I made me comfortable reading in front of people, and they made fun of me and stuff, so I just never really liked to read after that.
One of the things that probably amazed me the most is that when I was doing this, I would talk to the teachers in the class. And I would describe some of what we're talking about here. And I'd ask them, do you see this? And most of the time the teachers would say, well, that doesn't happen in my class. And then I'd interview the kids. These kids, right? And the thing about shame is that it's so powerful, and we so want to avoid it, we so want to hide it, we so want to keep from getting anywhere near it, that we're all kind of conspired to avoid thinking about it, talking about it, observing it. One of the things that was probably the most significant to me was talking to adolescents who had consciously come to the decision, very explicit, that they would rather fail their tests, right, than have to reveal to their peers and their teachers that they needed more time because of the reading thing. They understood it. If they could have had an oral exam about whatever it was, they could have aced it. But because it was reading, and reading was so laborious and slow for them, they needed more time than the time allocated on the test. And they realized this, but rather than asking for the more time and exposing themselves to the class and to the teacher. I mean, some of these kids talked about the degree to which they went to avoid their parents knowing about it. Right? So this is an invisible thing happening underneath the reading conversation that isn't just, again, an unfortunate emotional side issue. It's a core issue. It's a fundamental issue that's impeding children's ability to read.
If something reliably triggers shame, it's going to prevent learning. And it's going to make someone shy away from what triggered shame.
None of us gravitate toward activities that leave us with a sense of inadequacy or frustration, and especially if we see no resolution to that feeling.
I could see, even with the 9-year-olds, that when they were unable to read, it seemed to me even if I had a magic bullet, they didn't want to deal with it. They had already started to avoid print. And a lot of these kids would become active and look, in a sense, attentionally different, and possibly would have been diagnosed as ADD, but their attentional difficulties were just simple avoidance. They would become distractible, they would become fidgety when they had to read. The reason is they want to get out of that.
If not every time a child reads, but reliably, every once in a while when a child reads, that child experiences shame. And that feels awful. And that codes reading as a powerful source of shame. Wouldn't a child be stupid to voluntarily do something that's going to humiliate him?
I just make up an excuse. Say I don't have glasses with me. That normally works. But I don't wear glasses. It kind of busted me in the long run.
I always used to like slump down in my seat or something where they couldn't see me, or like if they wanted me to read, I'd pretend like I'm trying to figure out a question or something, that way they wouldn't pick me or anything. And yeah, it's pretty much what I've been doing for as long as I know.
Go to the bathroom, duck my head down, just make it look like I wasn't paying attention so they wouldn't call on me.
It was almost my turn to read. I would ask who's the first one and wait until it was done and then come back in. And one time, I was about to get an award for helping out some kids. And then they wanted me to read off my kid's name and everything, because I didn't remember what their name was. So I had left it, was the restroom, and went till the whole thing was over.
And I'd act like I was asleep, so they couldn't call on me. Or if they did call on me, I would wake up and say I can't read and go back to sleep and refuse to.
I'd make a scene not to do it. They would. I'd just act out, sleep, just wouldn't get up, just wouldn't ignore the teachers, just wouldn't talk, just rebel. That's the only thing I could do. I was just embarrassed. And when we get up there and try and fail at a word and hear everybody laugh.
When they begin to feel disappointed, angry, bored, they lose that sense of curiosity and interest in the task. They begin to say things to themselves like, this is no fun, I'm no good at this, my mom thinks I can't do it. And then the cognitive attributions begin to come in. And when children start to feel I'm no good at this, then their emotional interest in the task begins to decline rapidly. And then their attention wanders, and then you see another level of problem with the task. It's not just their emotional arousal, because we're all varying emotional arousal all day, but now we have the cognitive attributions that this task is too hard, I'm never going to be good at it. And when those attributions kick in, now we have another level of emotion regulation difficulty. And the more that happens, especially in classroom contexts in which children of all levels of processing are trying to manage the same tasks with one teacher, this is where children start to get turned off to reading and learning processes.
So, emotionally learning disabled, right? Avoidance. The stories, so exquisite, they're so masterful. Knowing just when to drop the pencil off the edge of the table so that their head will go down when the teacher's scanning around looking for the next reader. Incredible intelligence at work at hiding this. The main thing that I want to do, though, in addition to creating some kind of a draw for your compassion for their emotional condition, is I want to help you understand that this is fundamental to their ability to read, right? This is cognitively disabling. This is interfering with their ability to give attention, their ability to work through what it is they're ashamed of.
Shame starts out as a physiological reaction. What it does first is it turns off whatever thinking had been going on before. We call it a cognitive shock. Nobody can think clearly in a moment of shame. After that physiologic shock of shame hits, we then begin to think about what triggered it.
When you stop and think about what you're doing, try and analyze as you're going along, where are my eyes, what am I processing, how much am I getting now? It all breaks down.
And I'm like, oh, I hope I don't screw up, and I'm thinking about how much I'm going to screw up, and then I'm not really thinking about the reading.
You see them with a face of interest, track, look, listen, eyebrows down, eyes focused, looking like this, head forward. Then you see them slump for a moment when they can't get something. And then they're going to have one of a number of reactions to shame.
It basically takes the cognition hostage. It paralyzes the child.
It's a very maladaptive feedback cycle that you approach a task with anxiety because of concerns about your own performance. That distracts from your attention, your ability to focus on and process the information that's being provided, which impairs your performance more, which increases your anxiety. And this cycle continues to amplify itself.
You're trying to understand what you read, and you have interference from many sorts. It can be difficulty in recognizing words. It can be an emotional reaction that keeps you essentially off task or inhibits the understanding and the attention, especially the attention that you're trying to devote.
So, for example, the ability to process what the text is, to see the letter and recognize it, to be able to translate that into a sound, to understand that sound is part of other sounds that are going to form words, as those words are embedded in sentences. These are all complex cognitive and attentive tasks for children. If they're distracted by the feeling that they cannot do the task well, if they're saying to themselves at the same time, I'm not good at this, I don't like this is not fun, other children do this better than I do, I'm never going to learn it. All that talk and that emotional arousal is taking up what people call M space, or cognitive space in the task. And when that happens, those distractions diminish the child's ability to actually do the task that they're now struggling with.
Very few of the people who've studied reading have paid attention to the importance of shame triggered by failure to understand the code, and shame, therefore, producing this cognitive shock I've described. making it literally impossible to continue reading until that shame affect has waned and interest can be resumed in the process of learning to read.
Anybody here particularly good at the thing that makes you feel ashamed when you do it? Anybody? I mean, in a really evolved state, we might say, that's just, I feel incredible shame. That's interesting. Let me explore what's causing that. Right? And that would be really psychologically healthy if we could do it, but very few of us can do that, right? I mean, we're escape artists. Right? We want to get out of that. And that's primal. That's more primal than whatever somebody's telling us we ought to be doing. Its motivational center has enormous power. So what we're talking about then, at an unconscious level, just like reading itself has to function automatically, unconsciously, faster than we can think about it. You heard the one scientist say, Ringer say, that if I actually stop to think about it, it all breaks down. Right? I mean, it's one thing to meta-reflect on the meanings, and it's another thing to actually cognitively be aware of and think about the mechanics. If I'm trying to think about the mechanics, I'm lost. Right? The mechanical parts of this has to run automatically, fast, unconscious, without effort, transparent. Right? But at this unconscious level, there's an overwhelm of confusion. For all the reasons having to do with readiness trajectories and what have you that I talked about and that Reed really expanded upon, right? For the child that's not ready, whether their brain isn't processing fast enough, whether they don't have the phonemic differentiation of sound to match to the alphabet, right? Or even if they do, the confused correspondence between letters and sounds, right? Causing them a kind of stutter to figure out what that means now, or figure out what does this sound like here, right? So consider that whole thing as ambiguity overwhelm, confusion overwhelm. Right? So they hit the wall, and there's just this confusion. And what happens when they feel this confusion after too long, right? First of all, their flow stutters, right? In order for reading to really work well, it has to be a kind of cognitive entrainment, which means that it's just running on automatic pilot. The next thing's kind of in training, the next thing, which is kind of in training, right? Like on the railroad track, on the train. When the ambiguity gets too much, they drop out. They start to stutter. Like I said before, you can see that there's a core you can experience in your gut. You can watch it, observe it as kind of learner, teacher, scientists, that there's a correspondence between their hesitation in their voice and the confusion that their brain's processing. You know? So when they hit that, their flow stutters. As soon as their flow stutters, they start to feel the shame. When they feel the shame is now dissipative, meaning that it takes brain energy, it takes attention, right? It takes bandwidth, to use a technical term, to have shame going on, right? It's like if I was paying attention to, no matter what you're doing, once shame comes in, your mind's now paying attention to the shame, yeah? So there's less attention available to whatever it was you were doing before you felt the shame. So dissipative. The dissipation drops out of the entrainment process. So now, instead of kind of flying along and just a little stutter, I'm really dropping out. The more that this happens, this dropout happens, the more frustrating it gets, right? The problem is that it gets, the more that I'm starting to become self-conscious that this is something to do with me. This frustration is me. I'm blaming myself. You heard the one psychologist talk about how they start to come up with these cognitive attributions. I'm not smart. I'm stupid. I'll never learn to do this. If you really deconstruct those, what are those things? What are those things? What are those self-talks about? They're ways that say, if I accept that I'm stupid, if I accept that I'm not smart, if I accept that I can't read, the shame won't hurt. Which is, by the way, one of the shadow sides of the positiveness of the label dyslexia. Right? If I say, I met a number of kids, when I talk to them, they say, well, I have struggled with reading, but it's okay, I'm a dyslexic. Right? So there's a kind of a demotivational shadow to that, but there's also a shame protection thing to that. The point being is that these are dangerous labels, because if I start to accept, if every time I'm reading it's really convincing me that I'm stupid, because that's the only way I can protect myself from the shame associated with the reading, what am I learning in the course of learning to read? Well, the more that I blame myself, the easier it is to feel the shame when it triggers. Right? I kind of lower the threshold at which it's triggering. The more that happens, the more that my central preoccupation, the moment I start to even feel the shame kick at all, is how do I avoid this? Right? How do I avoid it? Leads back to more and more of this forming self-image that says, I'm not smart, I'm not good, I'll never amount to anything. I mean, I talked to one parent who's, and this, I don't mean to be over dramatic with this, but this is a true story, whose son was brilliant with his fingers and hands and great at lots of things, but he felt so bad about his inability to read, he hung himself at school to make a point for everybody how he felt. I wish that that was some kind of gross, kind of caricature extreme, right? I don't know how many, I mean, clearly shame is the #1 driver of teen suicide, right? But it's not all to do with this. But this is a massive contributor to how children feel about themselves and the kind of image they have of themselves as a learner. It infects their self-talk. Okay. I'm just checking time so that I don't get too much shame for over-traveling with you guys. One of the things I really recommend to everybody who's ever working with little children is to ask them the question, do you talk to yourself? You ever done that? You ever asked a little child whether they talk to themselves? It's a kind of a weird question. The child's first reaction will be, I'm not sure I should answer that. But the truth is we all talk to ourselves, right? And I want to suggest to you as kind of educators and parents that how a child's learning to talk to themselves is profoundly important. In a way, you could say and argue that their #1 learning environment, the one learning environment that's with them at all times, every day, every minute, for life, is how they talk to themselves. And what happens to a child whose mode of talking to themselves is self-punishing about their lack of intelligence? This is the collateral effect of what's happening in the course of learning to read. So they want to avoid anything that triggers it. And so now we've got kids going through school, and we think we're all about kind of been teaching them about this and teaching them about that, and they're going through figuring out how to hide. And we've got to read that, because when we talked about from the beginning of this, whether we talk about how much language exposure they've got, or we come at it from the first millennium bug and how messed up this code is, right? There's a million reasons why. A million is an exaggeration, but there's an incredible number of variables in play as to whether or not a child is going to take off with learning to read. But none of them have to do with it being the child's fault. Right? Not the mess in the code, not whether their parents talked to them enough, not whether their teacher knew how to unfold all of this confusion in a way that would stare away them into it. Right? None of this was their fault. And yet, all of us conspire, unintentionally but necessarily so, to create the condition in which the children that do struggle with this think that the struggle is a consequence of something wrong with them. We're all participants. The peer groups, the families, the schools, the entire system is creating this frame of reference in which they're experiencing their difficulty as a mirror that's saying, there's something wrong with me. 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 And they're believing that. And that's why learning to read is the biggest cause of the biggest learning disability. Okay, well, that's about all I got for now. I hope that if you're interested in this, tomorrow we're going to expand on the shame and learning conversations. I hope to come back to that. There's a lot more of this on the website that goes into shame and cognition and how all these things interrelate that we don't have time for today. Thank you.